Peter, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
It's a very exciting moment for me, I have to admit. I've been thinking about doing this podcast for a couple of years now. And one thing that always fascinated me about this particular city is that you come across some of the smartest people you can come across, or I came across in my life. And most of these people, they didn't plan to end up in Brussels. You know, kids, when they're growing up, they don't aspire one day to move to Brussels. It might be London, might be New York, might be some other places in the world, but Brussels is really not on top of that list. So you end up here, and usually what brings you here, it's work, or you follow a partner. Right? That's at least in 95% of the cases, that's my experience. I would say 90, 95, maybe even more percent of the people that I talk to, they end up here because they get a job or they come for education. But for me, that's also like the job category, because you come to get an education to stay and work, right? Or your wife gets a job in an embassy or a mission or somewhere else in the European Commission, and then you end up coming here. And that's where the name also, the idea for the name came, which is the money or love. Money being profession, job, love being person that you love. Then, like I said, you helped me last week fine-tune the name a bit, and now it's love and money, and that's the way we're gonna keep it. And basically, the whole idea was to look beyond the professional roles people have in this city. There's the whole podcast hype happening now in Brussels. I'm sure you know about that, and you came across probably various podcasts, but it's really about the title, who this person is, what does he think about politics, what does he think about lobbying, what does he think about... What I want to focus on is the people behind these job titles, because as you know, there's some very, very interesting people in the city. And then going back to what I said in the very beginning, I'm very excited that you're the first guest, officially. You know, so you're the first person that's sitting here, because I found your story and your background extremely interesting for numerous reasons. So perhaps we can just kick off with a very simple question, which is, was it love or was it money?
Oh, it was money.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. It was money, and then I think, to be fair, I came for money and stayed for love. But it was love.
That's very often the case.
It was love for the city.
Right. Really?
It wasn't really love for any.
So you enjoy Brussels that much?
Immensely.
Yeah. What did you enjoy about it?
I just feel at home here.
Yeah.
And it's hard, really, to rationally explain why.
Okay.
It's a love affair. I have a love affair with this city.
How long did it take you to realize that? Were you one of these people that for the first 3 years you tried to leave and then it happened?
Instantly.
Really?
Instantly.
Okay.
I mean, really, the minute I touched Brussels, I wouldn't say Belgian soil, but the minute really, I just felt something, and it's hard to define what it is.
And how long ago was this?
18 years.
18 years?
Yes.
Has it been that long?
It's been that long.
I didn't think that was that long. Oh
2007.
Okay.
And I was figuring it out when I said I would do this. I've now spent pretty much 1/3 of my life in Scotland, 1/3 of my life in England, principally in London, and 1/3 of my life outside of those islands, of which the vast majority, as I say, 18.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's almost as long as I've been here.
Have been spent in Brussels.
Okay. So, I mean, we're going to get to the part where you come to Brussels, but I am more curious about where it all started. And you shared your book kindly with me, My Choice of Words, which was actually very, very interesting.
Thank you.
So, like I said, I didn't have time to read it in detail, but definitely managed to...
You're better off not.
Oh, okay. All right.
No, it's one of those. It is.
But
one
that's
of those
why we're
books
here, right?
where you know from the format that it's you pick it up and put it down. It's digestible in individual chapters.
And I was just telling Clem this morning, colleague, how well it was written. I love the writing style. It's short and sentences to the point. And what I found also, it's very, it's honest, it's genuine, and in a way, you open yourself up and you expose yourself. So I'm definitely curious to learn more about where it all started. But I have a quote from the book, which I would like to read, and I would like to get your take on it, because I mean we are here to learn about Peter, right? So you say, I was always fond of being the last guy on the dance floor, the smartest man in the room, and the funniest fucker in town.
You can say that word.
Yeah, of course. So from everything that I've seen in the book and also knowing you, I found this one quite interesting. So how did you get to the point of being the last guy on the dance floor, smartest man in the room, and the funniest fucker?
I think in context, I offer that as a kind of apology to people who knew me in my youth. Yeah, I think. I hope you would not recognize that as the person who's sitting opposite you now.
We haven't shared the dance floor.
We never
yet.
shared. I don't think we have.
No.
Maybe not. No, I don't think we have. The serious point I was trying to make about that is I think I was maybe overtly too hedonistic in my youth.
All right.
Yeah. I liked to have
enjoy
fun.
life.
I like to have fun.
All right.
I think that somewhere else is a quote I like, and I'm not sure if it's in the book. There's an obscure, probably the only band who are the exponents of a little-known American music genre called acid country. And they're a band called Commander Cody and his Lost Planet M, and probably the only time they have been plugged on a podcast ever. Right?
Okay.
But they have a song, well, they had a song, I think probably mostly all dead now, called Too Much Fun. And I would like that as the epitaph on it, if I die in circumstances
Too much fun.
where I can afford a tombstone. And it says too much fun. The chorus of which is, there's a whole lot of things I ain't never done, but I ain't never had. Too much fun. Yeah. And I did relentlessly pursue fun.
All right. Because you do at some point, you refer also to this hedonistic element of your personality in the book as well. I might not go into quotes when it comes to these particular things, but so going back to the original question. So you were born in Scotland.
I was.
Yeah. Father, mother. You had two brothers. Two brothers. And
Have both still alive.
Okay. All right. And where was this?
I was born in Edinburgh.
Okay.
Although at the time, the family home was above a grocer's shop, shades of Margaret Thatcher here, in a village in a very beautiful part of Scotland in Fife called the East. The village is called Ely, and it's in a place called the East Nuke of Fife. I never really lived there. I don't have any strong recollections of that. And then we moved to a place called Troon, as in Trone here, spelled the same way. And it amuses me that I live in Excel and a bus passes my door every day with Troon as the destination board. It reminds me of home, you know. So I went to school there, and then I went to study law in Aberdeen University. So kind of when you say where from in Scotland, I feel as if I'm from all over Scotland, really.
Right. And why law? I mean, especially from a perspective of what you've done later in life. Why this decision to go study something that I was completely opposite?
Well,
was it the parents?
No, absolutely not at all. I mean, you know, I was lucky in that I grew up under absolutely no pressure to study anything or do anything. Early flirtations with the theatre. I kind of wanted,
which would be more
logical.
More sense,
more logical. Yeah. I do remember working in a solicitor's office in a provincial town in Scotland.
So this is after you graduated?
No, this was for a vacation job. Okay. And there was one afternoon I found myself killing flies with a man's death certificate. And there was a kind of moment's horror. And I went, you shouldn't, don't go there.
All right.
So I didn't.
And then you go to London, and in '79, if I remember correctly from the book,
Thatcher just
and you join a global advertising agency.
I did.
How? I mean, how do you? Okay, you're tilling flies with death certificates, and then
Only once. Don't you make that sound like?
Well, I don't know.
You
Right?
make it sound like it was habitual.
Anyways, it sounds better like this. So you're sitting there doing your traineeship or whatever you call it, right? And
No, this is a vacation job. I never started.
job.
I never started the what I can't remember what it's called. Apprenticeship.
Okay. So this is your apprenticeship, and it's obvious that you realize this is not something I want to be doing in my life, and that's fair enough. I think many people come to that realization.
But I think I was lucky to come to it.
But how do you A, make the decision, I want to be the ad man, and B, how do you get hired as one considering your background?
I think the second you'd have to ask them.
I mean, I'm asking you. Obviously, you managed to
the truth, but
brand
the truth,
yourself
the
in a
truth
good way.
is, wasn't initially hired in that main advertising agency. I was hired into their public relations company, and that very much was a consolation prize. You know, this was J. Walter Thompson on Berkeley Square.
Big name.
Yeah, but also
Still exists, right?
no, it's no longer called that.
It's been acquired,
no longer called that. I don't know what it's called now. It was merged into something that was merged into something else, and it's no longer. But for a long time, it was the world's kind of biggest. In London, it was they really only employed former guards officers. And then when the trend came to maybe we should hire people with university degrees, and that was when I was in the 70s. I mean, you know, this is a very kind of English version of Don Draper. Then it was very Oxbridge. You had to be into Oxford or Cambridge or
Really?
Oh, absolutely, maybe Durham or Warwick or Bristol at a pinch. It was very, very class oriented. There is a chapter in the book on class, and I felt it. I felt that I did not belong there acutely.
Really?
How did I get in? I think I'm quite a good mimic.
All right.
I managed to adopt the mannerisms of those kind of people.
But where did you pick up these manners from?
Oh, at home.
TV or
At home. My father's background in
he was a diplomat, right?
He was, a military attaché. Yeah, he was
All right.
Yeah, he was doing what the British were doing at that time.
Because your parents met in Syria, or
no, in Libya.
In Libya, sorry,
Libya.
Yeah, which is also very interesting.
Eldest brother was born there. But this is just But that's the circumstances of that generation, that war generation, particularly British people. That's what they were doing.
Yeah.
You know, I was never entirely clear. I knew what my father was doing because he talked about it, but I was never clear why my mother was, an instructress in physical education.
Oh, that's what
in North Africa in 1947. Wow. As a single woman.
And that's where they met.
Yes. Lovely story about on a train.
That's also, I mean, for those times, for a woman, to
Very,
go by
but
herself, that's kind of a trailblazing.
Well, and there may have been, I don't know.
Yeah,
she might have been in the same line of business as him. I have no idea.
Right. Okay.
These were not things that were taught. He talked about it,
right,
but she didn't talk about it.
Got it.
But I think it gave me an interesting. I think it not just helped. Maybe managing to kind of get in under the door into a place like J. Walter Thompson was part of it, but it certainly, I wasn't really aware of it, but it certainly gave me an interest and I hope an insight into geopolitics and that world, which I guess will eventually come to discover. And I never really, I wasn't conscious of having that insight. I didn't really read a lot in that area, but it was just sort of all around. You know, I grew up in a house full of Arabic artifacts and furniture, and in a small town on the west coast of Scotland, that was
rare,
odd. Certainly. Well, rare and odd, both rare and odd, I guess. But school friends who came to play were like, what's going on here? I wasn't really. It's
like
like
Indiana Jones.
Well, yeah, kind of. But you're not. If you're living it, you're not aware of it, are you? It's not. It doesn't seem special. It doesn't seem odd.
And this is the time when, and you mentioned this in the book, with Margaret Thatcher came to.
This is 79, yeah. Right. This is, I graduated the summer that she was elected, yeah.
And
I mean, it's funny talking about that now. That seems like prehistory, doesn't it? Pretty much.
What was this?
Thank you. Thanks for that. Having a conversation.
45 years
I was having a conversation.
It's like people think about Second World War in the 90s.
Oh, don't. You mean,
but that's the.
We're on video. People can see. I'm not worried about it. People can see. I'm really old. Yeah. But yes, so it was.
But these were very interesting times in the history of the.
Yes. I mean, I was at university.
And were you political at that time?
Oh yes. I was deeply into student politics. Yeah, I served as a full-time union officer while I was at university.
Union officer.
Yeah, I was deputy to a man called Alistair Darling, whose name you may remember. He was the British finance minister during the crash.
Interesting.
And I mean, very tragically died young a couple of years ago. But I continued to see him. I went to visit him.
So
went to visit him in number 11 just after the world financial crash, and we had an interesting conversation over a bottle of Treasury Sauvignon.
Yeah.
Very nice man, by the way. A very, very nice man.
And what was London like at that time? Because a lot of people talk about the 80s as
London in the 80s
golden age of advertising.
London in the 80s was fantastic, really. And I think there's a chunk.
Is this where you found your hedonistic side? Or?
It was further encouraged.
Further encouraged.
Well, now there was a salary to go with it, you see. So yeah. In fact, the other day, maybe yesterday, there was a very good Guardian article by reminiscences of David Bailey, the photographer, and he makes exactly that point. He said London in the 80s was just, they were happy times, huh?
Yeah.
For certain people, all right. I mean, let's not. It was a miners' strike. There was a lot of civil unrest in the United Kingdom at that time. Yeah. But that didn't really touch me in an office in J. Walter Thompson in Berkeley Square.
Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. And so what was your first? So you mentioned you started on the PR side.
Yes.
Writing?
No.
No.
I was in a PR agency, and then I was what was called at J. Walter Thompson an account representative. In other words, an account manager.
All right, so
executive
more the client side
totally business, client relations, totally.
My turn.
I rode the world on a smile and a shoe shine. Yeah. It was all very Arthur Miller, and I really enjoyed that on kind of great British blue chip brands, and then I moved. I stopped at J. Walter Thompson on the Friday, and I went to Saatchi & Saatchi on the Monday morning. And
when was this?
Chalk and cheese. Oh, this would be. Now you've asked me. 84, and then.
So until then, you were in the accounts
absolutely,
role, so not on
absolutely.
Okay.
And I went as an account director on the Mail on Sunday. I'm ashamed to admit, on Associated Newspapers. That was great as well. In the 80s, just working with editors and people. It was just Fleet Street, and it was fantastic. And then I, for one reason or another, managed to talk my way into the creative department. I managed to hang up my suit
and how did you
become a copywriter.
What was the point that you realized, it's I don't want to sell anymore.
It wasn't so much.
I'm selling.
It wasn't so much. I don't want to start. I do. I believe it or not, I do still enjoy not so much now, but the presentation, the closing the sale. I like that. Presenting more often, or making the argument.
Yeah, but then there's the theatrical part that comes with it, which definitely then is very closely linked to the creative part of your character.
While I was working at J. Walter Thompson, I, let's say, attracted the attention of one of the then creative directors who encouraged me in that direction. And who said, it wasn't so much I didn't want to sell anymore, it was a very respected creative director, a man called Paul Arden, You should check out some of his books.
Yeah?
Actually, no longer, but some wonderful, wonderful books, fantastic books. There's a book called "It's Not How Good You Are, It's How Good You Want to Be." It sounds like a dreadful self-help manual, but in fact, it's wonderful. He was an art director and just a great original thinker. And I remember having a conversation with him one day, and he said, "I really think that you're wasted doing what you're doing. I think you should come and work in my department." And I did.
You went to a different
and I did.
agency? Or?
No, that was at Saatchi.
So
I
you
went from
Saatchi.
Thompson's to Saatchi still wearing my suit.
All right, I see.
But you were edging ever closer to the creative because I was running a piece of business that was a Sunday newspaper. So that was just the it wasn't like classic fast-moving consumer goods brands. It was like every TV ads every weekend. And then on Monday you're a hero or a villain. It's all over, and you start again. It was the pace, that I enjoyed, and then I'd done that for maybe 18 months, and I was it was suggested that I might like to change horses, and so I did.
So what was your first project? Do you remember?
Yes, the first project of any significance. I mean, yes, there were lots of bits and pieces of radio commercials for promotions at petrol stations. I mean, you had, and I think we kind of missed that a bit today. In that people tend to start with big projects. You had to do the trade advertisement, the A4 page in the Grocer magazine, or the radio spot. I mean, you would not be trusted with a billboard or a script for a television commercial for really a couple of years, Again, I was lucky because of my newspaper background. There was a kind of brief doing the rounds that no one was interested in, and it was called Project Arthur, and it was the launch of the independent newspaper.
Right, I know this campaign.
And I somehow, I think if I'm being honest, I think it was summer and everyone was on holiday, and it just and the man running it had been a friend of mine for some time. I'd worked with in Gerald Thompson, and he went, "You know about newspapers? Can you do this?" So I did, and that was a substantial hit. I would say I had an Orson Welles career. I got the really good stuff out of the way at the beginning.
So what was this is the campaign. Perhaps you can say the
line.
Yeah, the
line
tagline,
is
which is
the independent. It is. Are you?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
And it's one of those things I say in the book. I wish I could claim having consciously thought of that. I didn't.
So how does at that time? I'm just curious. Also,
how it works. Yeah, because it's
my job.
But also that world is long gone. The job functions are long gone.
But how did it work? So independent newspaper comes to you. You're their agency, or it's a pitch?
No, we were the agency.
Yeah,
Saatchi's was the agency.
The agency, and they say we want to run a campaign.
It was a project. It was not yet the independent newspaper. It was the founders came with a project which was called Project Arthur, which was to launch
a newspaper,
the first new broadsheet newspaper launched in the United Kingdom for something like 150 years.
Did they have a name already or not?
No.
So you
I didn't know. By the time the brief got to me,
they had a name.
They tested various names. The one that it was, by the time the brief arrived on my desk, there were two of us, actually myself and an art director. By the time it arrived on our desk, it was called The Independent. Yeah.
Got it.
And the brief that was written, we've talked a lot about the brief. It's all down to the brief. The better the brief, the better the work.
Always.
And the brief, written by a marvelous planner called Claire Rossi, who's still out there somewhere. Hello, Claire. And the line she had written was, "The Independent, it's not written for sheep." So I and an art director wrote, a man called Simon Kornberg, again, always credit people you work with, sat down one night, and he wasn't my regular art director. My regular art director was on holiday, his regular copywriter was on holiday. We just kind of chummed up for an afternoon, par hasard. And we wrote a commercial about sheep moving off a hillside and leaving one behind. And at the end, and the sheep are going up into a truck, yeah? And the reveal at the end, the truck's tailgate closes, and it's a butcher's truck.
But the one went its own
stayed
way.
behind. Yeah. Right. And the camera cuts back to the one who has stayed behind. And we wrote a line on it, which the Independent is not written for sheep. And we took it to our then creative group head, a man called Tim Mellors. I'm calling out all the names here as possible. And he said, he was from Derbyshire, and he said in his wonderful northern accent, nice, it's a nice ad, but that line, it sounds like it was written by some fucking planner. And of course,
what was the planner? I mean,
which was
from
Claire Rossi. Planners were wonderful people.
But what was the role of a planner in the
Well,
agency
what everyone now calls themselves strategists.
Okay, so
but a planner would be. But really the voice of the consumer, really the voice of reason. Yeah, right. You would have said in those days the job roles with the account man represented the client.
Right.
The creative people represented the idea, and the planner, the account planner, represented the consumer. Could give a consumer perspective. A lot of planners I worked with, I joked that they just got paid loads of money for reading magazines.
Right. Yeah. I see.
But research, but not just research.
So it's research, audience, which platforms from today
it's a great.
Using
No, they weren't like the media planners. They're different.
Yeah, they were just
different.
the
Account planners.
newspapers.
No, account planners were like
So who would decide whether this campaign goes in the newspaper or in the billboard?
That's media planners. In those days, agencies were. I'm sorry if people find this incredibly boring.
That's my world.
I'm sure there's anyone else.
And I'm sure there'll be people from agencies who are watching this as well.
But in those days, you see, we're now going back to the 80s when agencies were full service agencies. They were not just creative agencies. The same agency did your advert and bought the media and placed it. And in fact, they earned money off commission from media, rather the creative was given away for free because they were taking
50% of the ad spend, right?
Yes. Now, if in the 80s you were taking 15% of airtime, which was inflating at 20 to 30% a year, you were on a good for about a decade. If you owned an ad agency, you were making a lot of money, which is why in the UK at that time a lot of them went public. A lot of them became quoted companies because it was pretty much the best thing you could own next to a bank.
But I guess that's where because if you looked at the PR, communications, advertising industry today, you just have a couple of big players which own a lot of smaller players.
There's the three left. Yeah.
But basically, the roots of that then go back to those times when you had this huge growth.
And it was constantly changing because the talent would constantly quit and start their own shops. Right. Yeah. And that was second generation, third generation, fourth generation. Yeah. Or then you sold out. I mean, more often than not, the great independent agencies I worked for, Abbott Mead Vickers, Bartle Bogle, Hegarty, these are names that will mean something to anybody who studied the history of advertising. These were individuals from other agencies who left and set up their own shops and then ultimately got bought out by either the people they used to work for or by other. But virtually all, we're talking about the name J. Walter Thompson no longer exists. Most of those names no longer exist. And I think those that do are in a very, very, you run an agency, it's a very, very competitive market now with razor thin margins. And nobody, I think after the media left, nobody really figured out a satisfactory means of getting paid for creative work, for getting paid for ideas. How do you pay for an idea? How long it took you to think of it? A percentage of the sales that result? How long's a piece of string?
It's an undefined business model.
Yes.
And my personal feeling these days, it's almost like every agency has its own way of operating, functioning, and its own business model of how they manage, how they charge.
I don't understand how a lot of agencies make anything nowadays. I don't. They seem to do okay. Actually, not a lot of them do. You guys do. You're,
We try.
But that's a whole other thing. I mean, what's called, you see, it's interesting you were talking and using the word advertising. People don't anymore. It's kind of fallen out of use, really, hasn't it? It's communications now.
Communications is more of a overall, overarching global term to put everything. The way I see advertising is a way, at least today, from today's perspective, and how we use it in our work is once you have a piece of creative which is based on certain messaging, how do you make sure that that's in front of the eyes of the people?
Yeah, you see, that's what I would call media. Yeah, it's just different times, different. I think
because media is less relevant these days. You can skip the whole if you use social media advertising or you can skip the traditional media altogether today to get in front of the eyes of the
one
people.
of the things I see doesn't really affect me much nowadays. That I'm spend most of my time writing poetry. One of the things I see is that the roles have all turned into one. So you will see job hirings if you look on LinkedIn. And
Swiss knife.
Yes, they want everybody. Yeah. They want everybody. They want planner, account man, copywriter, art director, designer, media placement, everything, and it's one person. Yeah. And it's part-time.
Yeah. And underpaid.
And it's 200 a day.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you see. Yeah.
But going back to the independent campaign, would you say this is, because I've heard you talk about this campaign before.
No.
So I do know you take special pride in this particular piece of work. Would you say that this is one of the taglines you came up with that really stands out, or are there others that you would throw into that category?
Work that I'm proud of, or that I'm happy about, there's a Levi's commercial that's pretty well known. I still meet people of a certain age go, you did that? Wow. Because it was in cinemas all over Europe. And it's the one in which, do you remember the famous 501s commercials?
Yeah,
there was a campaign started by John _Hegarty of BBH, now Sir John Hegarty of BBH. And it was the famous one with the laundrette, the man who goes into a laundrette and stone washes his jeans in a laundrette. That was the first one. I did the fifth in that, again with my art director, Michael Marcus.
This was at Saatchi?
No, this was at BBH. We've now left. In those days, you left agencies every 2 to 3 years, right? This was at BBH.
But this is still in this 80s.
Yeah. This is still down the road in Soho, but just different people, and much smaller. It was then a start. It became a kind of micro network with offices in different parts of the world. But at that time, it was one office in Soho, and it was early in its life. I think I was one of 8 or 10 creative teams working directly for John Hegarty, which was an immense privilege, and you learn very, very quickly working for someone of that talent, day in, day, seeing them 2 or 3 times a day. You learn your stuff very quickly, and you were trusted to do very important work to a high standard, day in, day out. So myself and my new partner had not been there very long, a matter of weeks, when he came into our office and presented us with the brief for the 5th in the series of 501's commercials. This was probably the most famous campaign in British advertising at the time. And it was like pressure. It was like, a great opportunity.
Did it be found online?
Yeah. It's called Refrigerator. And the plot is basically a mysterious man stops at Roadhouse for the night. Very beautiful daughter of Roadhouse owner stores his 501s in a refrigerator and he puts them on in the morning in front of camera and then leaves as mysteriously as he arrived. Yeah, it's kind of Postman Only Knocks Twice, but with jeans, really. And he said modestly, and it is, it is. And it was in those days, the production budget on that commercial, European cinema commercial, would have been of the order of £500,000 sterling. I mean, that was location shoot. Do we ignore that?
No.
Gesundheit. That was, and the talent you worked with. was a lady called Tatiana Paziz, who was one of the original 5 supermodels, that Vogue cover. She died very recently, 2-3 years ago, young, in her 50s. The director also died, fell off a cliff while shooting a commercial. Lovely man called Roger Lyons.
So he's died.
Who would have?
He died by doing.
Yeah. And just to give you an idea of the talent you worked with in those days, the director of photography was, it sounds like everybody died on this, but it was also who died of COVID, actually. It was a man called Alan Davier, who was the director of photography on E.T., Empire of the Sun, won an Oscar for The Color Purple. I mean, this was your crew on a script that you had written.
With the $500,000 budget, I guess you can afford.
Yes, but also at that time, that kind of talent, Alan Davier was the most charming. I mean, dinners in motels in California with him every night for a week. The most charming man. And as you can imagine, a great raconteur, and he just kind of probably having a week off from Spielberg, and you felt that part of that magic. You felt kind of touched by that magic. It was a great experience.
And I have a question about your perspective on how things have evolved over the next 30 years. But before that, just to go back, so during the 80s, you changed the agencies in London.
Oh, a lot.
You lived the life.
Yeah. I found time to get married and have 3 children.
So that's what I was.
So,
So because I mean, I'm a father, I'm a husband, and it's challenging balancing things. And you had 3 children, 3 daughters, if I'm not mistaken. So it was during the 80s that you met your wife.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Had the 3 children over this period.
90s,
right?
80s, 90s.
80s and 90s. But I also know that this is not your wife anymore. So how did you...
It's a very polite way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean...
divorced.
Yeah. And because I think many of us who live this sort of a very busy lifestyle find this challenge of balancing family and work. And a lot of people want to say that today it's more challenging than ever. I'm not so sure about that. And so if you could go back, what would be the things that you would change? Because I assume you, at least from your perspective during that time, you would have preferred to make it work somehow.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to fail at anything, and they particularly don't want to fail at marriage and at parenthood. Yeah, no.
Was it the dynamic of work that...
That's everything. That's everything. I think that if I'm honest, and I try and say it in the book, I should never have been a creative director. I had a reasonable talent for writing, for doing the work. I'm not a manager. I think the line I put in the book is, I can barely manage myself. But to expect me to manage, 30, 40, 50 people like me, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I think that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. Although having said that, I had no option but to get better and then go and do it again. And I went and did
because
it again
you took
abroad.
A break.
Yes.
And this was which period?
Oh, I took a break, really the beginning, around the turn of the millennium, around the turn of the century.
End of the 90s.
So yeah, I think,
so
yeah.
a good 20 years.
2000, probably yes, I know exactly. 2002, for 2000 for 3 years, I didn't go anywhere near an ad agency.
But you did 20 years in this hardcore environment.
Yeah.
That's but I think, you mentioned a breakdown or not, that deserves a break.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't, people at that time did not take career breaks.
Yeah.
You got on that treadmill and hamster wheel, and you kept going for all it was worth. Yeah. Because if you didn't, someone would push you off it, and you had to. And I had my wife was an artist. I had 3 young children. We had become accustomed to a certain life. Yeah. So you kept on doing it, you know. And even once I was better, I went and carried on. The only place I could do it was abroad, and I went to do it. I went and did it in Poland, and I went and did it in the Middle East, and I went on to. Ultimately, I ended up doing it here, or rather, not doing it.
Yeah, well, and there's one quote in the book which I found interesting, since we're talking about your professional life. You say, all in, let me see. Yeah, so, and this is interesting considering you mentioned that you managed a number of people as well. So all in all, I spent 12 years working as a creative director in 5 different agencies in 3 different countries. Yes. If we ever work together, I can only offer my apologies and hope that you have recovered from the experience as fully as I have. So
I mean that. I meant that when I wrote it, and if there's anybody who hasn't heard it, who has been affected, I'll repeat it again. Yeah, I don't think I was a very nice person to be around.
Are you talking about the managerial part of, so when you were creative director?
Yes.
Or even before?
Maybe a bit before, but it was I was in full flood by the time the first person was crazy enough to give me a job as a creative director. Yeah. I really was not a very nice person to be around at that time. Maybe I'm not a nice person to be around now, but I'm a lot better, a lot calmer.
Was it the temper? Was it
anger? Anger management, you know, and it's. Do you know? There's a quote. Somebody else, David Timmis, who spoke here, took from the book and in a very nice review, and he said, elsewhere when I talk about Brussels, I talk about Brussels is a good place to learn patience and acceptance. Right. And I, go right back to the beginning of this, and I really like Brussels. I feel at home in Brussels, and I think one of the real benefits for me of making it my home, I learned patience and acceptance. I really got rid of a lot of not all of the anger, but a lot of the
But
anger.
was it about you, or was it about the people? Because you say also in the book...
question. That's a really interesting question.
You say in the book, where is it? You say, when you choose to surround yourself with assholes, then you shouldn't be too surprised when you start to behave like one.
Oh, sorry.
So, I mean, because...
I think I have a very ambivalent relationship with that industry and with what that industry was doing, if I'm honest now. I do feel, not shame, but some guilt for my part in... I don't know, at the moment, I'm reading the last Yanis Varoufakis book about techno-feudalism. And he liberally quotes from Don Draper in his critique of capitalism and the death of capitalism and the evils of capitalism, yeah? And I have to find myself nodding along. And certainly for the best people around me, the John Hegartys, the David Abbotts, their talent and what they contributed to popular culture more than outweighs any lingering sense of, I'm not setting myself up as a plaster saint saying, these people were doing terribly evil things. No, they were not. And just clear that up. And in fact, at that time, they were adding to the gaiety of nations. They were entertaining and amusing people and contributing to popular culture, In a way, I mean, that's interesting, so, but the change to now, in a way that their successors now I don't believe are. We had a conversation the other day when I said that what had changed in advertising and communications is it had gone from the art of seduction to behaving like a stalker. And I think that's the difference. That's where, when data and data analysis and digital world came in, it was no longer necessary to seduce because you could just stalk people. You could just follow people around the internet, beating them over the head. you know.
But that's technology, right? Back in the days, you had to go on a date. These days, you have Tinder. I mean, you still go on a date, but you strip a whole...
I know which I prefer. We all make our choices. And I know which I prefer.
And
you won't catch me on Tinder.
Yeah. And so, going back to early 2000s, you take a break, and then you take on different new roles. So you were in Warsaw, Poland.
Yeah. I found that was, at that time, fascinating.
What was fascinating about it?
Just this kind of pace of change of that country. People, I'm very fond of, it sounds so patronizing, I'm very fond of Polish people. Like Chinos, but no, I don't mean that at all. I really enjoyed that experience. And in that first book, in My Choice of Words, I talk about it as that was my bachelor's degree in being European. Spending 2 years living in a new European capital.
Was it comparable to London in the 80s?
Not at all. Not at all. Chalk and
What was
cheese.
different?
The economy, for one thing.
Okay.
And it's interesting because I think it made me think. I think that's the first time it made me think about the stuff we were just talking about responsibility and social responsibility and everything. You know, this was a country where the whole idea, where the whole notion of consumer society, the whole notion of choice, the whole notion of advertising was entirely new. Yeah. And this was a society that had lived under a totalitarian regime for the last, 45 years, whenever it was. Yeah, 45 years, yeah. And that, to me, so you couldn't make the same assumptions about what advertising was and how it worked.
So, but concretely, I'm interested. So, what was different on your end of the work when it comes to campaigns and projects that you worked on?
It was a big.
And you spent 2 years there.
Yes.
Yeah? And did you leave at your own will?
No.
No.
I've never left anywhere at my own will.
Fair enough.
To be fair to them, the big bits of international business they had, which I was most involved in, or which I found least interesting. I found the most interesting bits Polish businesses. I worked on a Polish newspaper called Gazeta Wyborcza, which you may know, kind of a Polish Guardian, a leftist paper, which grew out of Romeo things from Solidarność in the ship. I mean, and same people, the same people. And you got to meet these people, Adam Michnik and any Poles. I mean, a hugely privileged place to find yourself. Certainly wasn't a tourist. No, the kind of the bits of business that were earning the money to pay for me left. And that's just an international realignment. That's just to do with the Americans. And it no longer made economic sense for them to keep on this expensive, exotic bird. But I did have a great time.
And then the next stop was Dubai.
Well, back to London for a bit, and then Dubai. Yeah.
And how does that happen?
Again, a phone call.
Yeah.
Somebody saying, we need someone like you. I like in the book.
And who was it for? Who did you work for in Dubai?
That was for BBDO.
BBDO.
And I had worked for BBDO. You see, when I was AMV in London, became part of BBDO. So I'd done some network business. My name was known inside some of the echelons of BBDO. So, when they came to look at candidates, this guy's a BBDO guy. This guy knows, he's worked on some of the business, Pepsi and stuff like that. So yeah, off I went. And I in fact write about the symmetry of my parents having worked in that part of the world. And I think that kind of made me curious. I want to, and talking about growing up with these artifacts around you and a real fondness for Arab culture. My father wrote and spoke Arabic fluently. And
was he alive at the time?
No, he was dead by then. Died young. They both died comparatively young. But I thought, I'm gonna. And I remember growing up with tales of what heaven on earth Beirut was. And I thought, I'm get the opportunity to go and live that for a bit. I did it, and I really enjoyed it. That was varied. I mean, I would say It was a lot tougher than Poland.
Why?
Culturally.
Yeah.
Yeah, culturally. And whilst you will, I've got to be really careful what I say now, because I'm going to get, some of the people I'm talking about could make your car blow up. You know? No, I was conscious of that there. I am not joking. Not Gulf Arabs. I had good relationships with Gulf Arabs. A lot of respect for local clients. But some of the local management, primarily Lebanese businessmen, didn't really like this Brit on their patch.
Was there a particular reason?
Like,
you say cultural, or was it that you were too straightforward?
Yeah.
Respect
I would say
authority?
things. I would say things that I thought were funny, but were regarded as thoroughly disrespectful.
All right. So
See, I was used to ad agencies. Just explain. Can I just plea in mitigation before you connect the detonator? Is that I was brought up in, this is part of my Anglo-Saxon cultural thing. Agencies were places of great humor, great. English management is a kind of management by insult, but it's not maimed. It's banter, they call it. I don't particularly like that, actually, in English character, but that's, don't assume you can import that into another culture. It just comes across as rudeness. So a bit of that. And also, I think a bit of my kind of quite easy way with Gulf Arab clients, with local clients. They didn't like, a lot of them didn't like, they were the interpreters, they were the gatekeepers. Don't get too close to what is perceived as our clients.
So now you're in Brussels.
Yes.
Now we did a full circle, and you come to this beautiful city, and now you are without a job.
Yes.
And this is which year?
Oh, goodness me, when was that? When did I come back? 2010, I think. I have to say that trip to Dubai was short-lived.
Yeah, you mentioned a few weeks.
Months, where I was a few weeks in the job, but then then I stuck around and did some work for other people for a while. Did some work in Qatar for a while. That's an interesting place. And then came back and never went back again.
So you jumped to Brussels.
Yeah.
And what was the plan at that time? Besides being happy and in love?
Being in love was kind of the plan. The plan was, I figured there was no way I was going to leave Brussels. And I quickly figured out that if you could write, if you're a native English writer, you probably weren't going to starve in this town. So I started going out and pitching stuff, selling stuff. And quite quickly found, firstly, some Belgian SMEs, actually, were the first who came in.
And why did they need English writer?
The first was a very, very interesting pharma consultancy outfit in Ghent, run by a really fascinating man. And I have no idea where the contact came from, possibly LinkedIn, possibly, I lost in the mists of time. But he had offices in the US and in India, and he wanted everything in English. And especially he wanted everything in English, as opposed to US English. So that was my first gig. And then pretty swiftly after that, a trade association. And then another trade, and I built up a nice little business doing that.
Portfolio of clients.
Yeah.
And it was writing, or was it creative?
Both. A lot of it was conceptual stuff. What I did, I'll make a quick pitch for it. Again, if anybody haven't done one for years, but what I call a value proposition, which is, somebody like my pharma client in Ghent, brilliant people with a brilliant niche product, but an inability to explain it, translate it. And my partner at the time, the love I came back for, was a very, very talented graphic designer. So as a duo,
tandem,
we managed to build quite a nice little business. Yeah. The trade association thing particularly was for an organization called IFRA, who are the International Fragrance Association. Just by luck, a fascinating, sensual, tactile trade association.
Sensual is the right word.
Yeah, and in those days they were selling themselves, they were presenting themselves as men in white coats, talking about safety. And, you know, a new director came in who was a brand guy from L'Oreal.
Ah.
And he wanted to, no, I don't want to do this. I remember the brief was to take us out of the laboratory and into the bedroom.
Nice.
Which we did. Grey brief, see again, grey brief. Their strapline, the International Fragrance Association, promoting the safe enjoyment of fragrances. And I remember going to the first meeting and saying, that's like me introducing myself and, hi, I'm Peter, and I've just stopped beating my wife. and the French guy laughed and he went, exactly that. And we replaced it with, and it's funny you say, is it creative or is it writing? And this is a really good example of strategic creativity. Yes, it's writing, but it's much more strategic. I proposed replacing the safe enjoyment of fragrances with 3 words, in every sense. And that gave rise to an architecture of the senses. So there was a sense of prosperity, there was a sense of responsibility, there was a sense of, I can't remember what they all were, but there were 5 senses. And then around that we built and we went on to do exhibitions in the Parliament. We made a 20-minute documentary film about bergamot farmers in Italy. I mean, it was really open. That an example of where a good piece of creative strategy is what opens the door to good work. It's not what an old boss of mine used to call communication as a burst on the banjo, which is like one quick, and then it's gone. No, if you get it right, that's a red thread that will take you all the way through. And it was reflected in photography, it was reflected in typography, it was reflected in everything we did. And I put the example before, it produced a positive result. It changed legislation. Not that campaign alone, but the approach of, rather than a lobbyist saying, what the Commission does not understand. And again, it's like, stop beating your wife. But rather presenting themselves as, I always like to say, old school lobbyists said to me, what you are in that example is a soft lobbyist, because what you're doing is creating an environment in which they come to you and say, we're going to do this, what's your opinion? Rather than you going to them and saying, what you do not understand. Which do you think is more likely to get a result?
Right.
And they did it. And it was a very, I did that 3 or 4 years, and they invested in it. I'll give a shout out to the man who was their comms director, a man called Stephen Weller, who an English guy who just got it, and his boss got it.
And where is he now?
Both of them were fired.
Oh, man.
Story of my life, really, isn't it? No, there was a change of regime.
Okay.
And they decided they didn't want to do that sort of thing.
Are they still working in the bubble?
Yes, and they still have a big trade association, very rich trade association. And to the best of my, last time I looked, they were still using in every sense. They sort of sharpened up the edges a bit, but yeah. And there were a few more,
I know that you worked on the European Parliament's campaign for the 2019 elections, right? And how did you end up there?
Again, a phone call out of the blue, randomly. No, actually, I was employed by somebody else as a writer on a project to write a handbook of communications for them. And for one reason or another, that group fell apart. And when it stopped, and it stopped before the project was even really finished, it was kind of half done. And I remember it well, because I was, again, another phone call, but I was in Tuscany. I remember lying by a swimming pool in Tuscany, and I got a phone call from someone who had been on the project team from the Parliament side, saying, we want to finish the book, but we'd like you to do it. And I said, what about, no, they're not involved anymore. Could you come in? And so I did it. I finished it for them.
Communications handbook.
It was called Communication Creates Community. The something handbook, the consistent guidelines for consistent communications by the European Parliament. Yeah.
And who was it for?
Snappy title. Huh?
Yeah.
When I pick up an airport, you know. It was for the European Parliament.
And who would be reading this?
Employees.
Nobody.
Employees.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, actually, your first guess was correct. Because nobody read it. It was issued. It was signed off by the then Director General. I was amazed how kind of painless it was, and great, really nice group of, or two people in particular, who kind of steered it. And I said, well, I'll do it as a writer. And they said, no, you go and find an art director and designer. I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to work with your internal people, your internal graphic designers, which turned out to be a stroke of genius because, of course, once it was the responsibility of people who worked there, it was a lot easier to get through than it was. So did that, and then very soon after, I had a phone call from one of those people at the Parliament, a lady called Tanya Rudolph, and she said, would you be interested in coming back to help us some more on the elections? So I did.
And did you get tasked with coming up with a tagline for the? Okay, so this was your.
Yes.
So tell me, what was so basically?
It's fair to say I wasn't the only person who was tasked with that.
And does it? So how does this work in practice? You have multiple people coming up with their ideas, and then an idea gets picked, or you work together to come with one idea.
No, it was that. No, you can never. You should surely by now know well enough that you cannot go to the hierarchy of the European Parliament with one option. They must be given.
But did you work as a team?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. No. In that specific case, I went away and I came back with the idea, working entirely by myself. At the same time, other people, though there were no other externals, there were internals, did what they proposed, yeah. And 3 proposals went to the Secretary General, and my proposal was
You can say it.
selected.
Yeah.
Oh, the line.
Yes.
This time I'm voting.
Yeah. And I think pretty much everybody knows about this tagline. What was the thinking behind it? How did you?
This is an interesting one, because the best things come from. See, I always I had a brilliant creative director, Paul Arden, the guy I was talking about in the books, and he used to say, if you can't think of anything, look out the window and have an idea about the first thing you see. So at least you've started having ideas. Your first idea might be about a tree, and it might have nothing to do with what you're, but at least you're now having ideas. You've moved on. And I was in Madrid. I'd been on vacation, and I'd had a couple of days in Madrid on my way back, and I was out for a stroll and a couple of San Miguel's. And I walked past a fire station, and there was a fire engine, and the fire crews sitting around, hot Madrid night, And I was going to say they were drinking beer, but they probably weren't drinking beer. That was probably in my imagination. And the thought came into my head, which was, I'm voting for them. And then immediately I went, well, I'm voting for you, and I'm voting for you. And I'm voting for my friend, and I'm voting for the guy who runs the fish bar, and I'm voting for. And I thought there was a really nice turn on. You're not voting for politicians. We're all voting for each other, yeah. And the original idea was, this time I'm voting for something, for someone. Now, we did some of those. and some of those are very nice. I used to have friends sit for portraits of a lovely one of an Italian father and daughter, and it's just a nice portrait. And it's just, this time I'm voting for them. But this time I'm voting basically for them. Right? And I sensed early on there was a resistance to making it about citizens. I think that was, if I can be frank, a little bit leftist. A little bit. So it evolved. This time I'm voting was fine, but it evolved into for privacy, for family time, for the right.
And what was the thinking behind this? What was the reasoning to change it
For me?
from? No, I mean,
Oh, because I think the emphasis on citizens, as I said, was a bit leftist. I think they wanted to talk more about the work of the parliament and politics. I mean, that's fine. Did I say? I'm probably being rude saying it was a bit leftist. I think the individualization, the route into the citizens, which to me is what made it a community, actually. Some people were uncomfortable with. So, I mean, I'm not complaining about that. It was a very nice campaign, and we did do, I think, we did do some of those, but it evolved more in the direction of this time I'm voting for,
GDPR.
Human rights. Well, I did try and whenever, because you got given things like, this time I'm voting for GDPR, and you go, I think it would be better to say, to protect my privacy. And we did that one, and it was a very nice photograph of that, of a woman on a mobile phone, but behind smoked glass.
Honestly, I still think to this day, and I've been in Brussels nearly 20 years, it's still the best piece, best campaign I've came across, or one of the best campaigns I came across. Do you remember we just had the elections last year, do you remember what was the tagline? Because I don't.
No, of course I do, because I mercilessly took the piss out of it.
Yeah.
Everywhere I could.
What was it?
It was hashtag use your vote. And every time I typed it, I typed hashtag use your vote, hashtag tidy your room, hashtag clean your teeth. Because that's what it was.
Order.
Well, no, but that's the tone. The tone was an instruction. It was, I'm going to be real. It was tone deaf. It was tone deaf. And it was at a time when I can remember around that time there were a lot of farmers' protests. Yeah, and I remember even in Brussels they were spraying the streets in milk and stuff. Remember that? And one of the things that struck me that the farmers were saying was, "We're tired of being told what to do by Europe." So into that, that's your audience's attitude. What do you do? You tell them what to do. It's not fun. I mean, it is funny. It's tone deaf, but it's kind of arrogant as well, I think.
And then you end up with the parliament that you end up with this time.
I'm not going to comment.
Yeah. You have every right not to.
I'm not going to.
Or every right to comment. No, this is and you as you were explaining a bit your thought process of how you came up with the idea. And I think this could be interesting also for a lot of people that are listening or watching. For somebody who's been a creative your whole life, basically, probably since you were a child, right? Maybe you did go to study law, but probably when you look back, you probably remember things that you did as a child that were signs that you would be a creative person.
I don't.
No?
I was a bit of a nerd. I was a bit of a scientist and a mathematician and stuff. And I was at school. That's the things I enjoyed and excelled at. I didn't really. There was nobody, and there's no artists in the family.
Yeah.
Apparently, my brother tells me if you go back to the 17th century, there's a well-known Scottish poet. I imagine that.
So how does that creative process? Is there a process? Because you talked about looking through the window, you watch a tree, and then you sort of get the momentum going with ideas, and then you talked about being in Madrid, walking around, just wandering. You know that I've had a very close relationship with another great creative, Richard, whom you knew.
Yeah.
And
I think he worked. I think he worked in a kind of similar way. Didn't he? Music was his big thing.
Yeah, exactly. But he had his way with words, and he always said that it doesn't come as a result of some kind of a structured process. that it can come at any point. You just have to put yourself in situations so it can happen.
So true.
Is that your or did you actually have a process? I sit down, this is the environment which I sit in, this is what I start writing.
But I think the best, you see, if I think of The Independent, it is Are You. If I think of This Time I'm Voting, I would say they're not really things that I'm aware of thinking of. They arrived. The great Paul Arden, guy I was talking about, he used to talk about this room is full of ideas. They're in the ether. And what we are is aerials. And you just have to put yourself in the position of an aerial. You have to receive it. And I'm too familiar with it now, but at the time when I was thinking about it, sort of shiver down the spine thing, that is exactly how The Independent happened. I remember I told you the setup about it, it's not very machine. We left that creative director's office, didn't go back to my office, went to another office. And when people were like, oh, what are we doing? And I just remember picking up a pen and writing, It Is Are You, in very, very small letters, within seconds of the other one being rejected. And I was like, and somebody's supposed to spotting, you see, it's the thrower and the catcher. You know this thing about why creative people work in pairs, the thrower and the catcher, the thrower and the catcher. And somebody
Thrower and the catcher.
Yeah. Nice. So, and you're both at the same time. So you can both be both at the same time, actually. It's totally illogical. It means nobody's catching anything. I'm sorry, that's complete nonsense. And somebody in the room, in those days it was magic markers and layout, A4 layout, A4 layout pads. And someone had picked up a big magic marker and just wrote, It is .RU, question mark. And suddenly this thing that I used to joke to people, I said, I don't know, it must have been in the pen. I should never have thrown that pen away. You know, that pen was obviously full of great ideas. And took it up and went back into the room the guy rejected it. Held it up and went, that's more like him. And it was, that whole process took under 5 minutes. Under 5 minutes. And similarly,
it's what leads to these 5 minutes. That's right.
That's the old thing about the engineer tapping it with the spanner, isn't it? Why do you charge me all that money? Because I've learned how to do that. I know what spanner to use. Exactly the same walking in Madrid with the thing about the election. And I can't be sure, but I think it was before I was even asked to work on the election. It was just a thought in my head. And I remember going back to hotel, I was saying, and writing, that for you, this time I'm voting. A lot of it is also, I still work with a pad and a pen. Most of the thought, because a thought will become concrete quicker than by typing it. Now, a minute later I'm at the typewriter working it out, but usually it's just drawing lines between words. The last thing, the final thing, we were talking about Richard and creativity. I used to, I'm now teaching this thing called the Poet School, which is another plug, is to teach people in the bubble to write more poetically, to write better, to write more, to make better, more engaging content. And a long time ago, I used to teach this in ad agencies to people who are generally more receptive. And I used to start a presentation. I remember doing this in Moscow many years ago, and people going, what is this guy on about? But you got their attention.
What did you do in Moscow?
And you're teaching creativity. A long time ago, a long time ago. 90s. But in agencies. And I would start, I wouldn't say anything, on the screen, I would play a film, it's actually a Nike advert, but it's not the point, of Tiger Woods' golf swing, slowed down. Stop and say to people, what is that man doing? And everybody would say, he's hitting a golf ball. So no, he isn't. No, he isn't. He's hitting a, and then finally one person would think, he's swinging a golf club. You go, yes, that's what he's doing. The golf ball is incidental. The golf ball is in the way of him swinging the golf club. That's having an idea. If you try and have it, if you sit at the desk, I'm now going to have an idea. No, it's not. That isn't. You can do that all month. It's not going to happen. Richard was right. You have to be an aerial. You have to put yourself in the position to receive the idea. You have to swing the club. not hit the ball. Now that requires, you was talking about frame of mind, the closest I've ever got to defining the frame of mind is that it asks for two entirely counterintuitive, like playing the drums or flying a helicopter. You have to do two counterintuitive things at exactly the same moment. You have to be completely focused and utterly relaxed at exactly the same moment. It's not easy.
And Peter, I have to ask you this because when we talk about very creative people, not just in the world of communications, but also in music and so on, there is very often this connection to between creativity and the altered state of mind.
Gates of perception.
And there's a quote in your book where you say, you say, drugs don't make you clever, but they don't stop you from being clever either. So
see, that's the sort of thing that is much easier to type than to talk about.
Right.
that's why it's in a book.
Yeah.
Not a podcast.
I mean, you can always.
Okay, no, but I will. I'm going to, in the spirit of the book, which you were kind enough to describe as honest, very honest, brutally honest in places. I mean, in my mind, there's lots of whiskey's a drug, yeah, beer's a drug, wine's a drug, nicotine's a drug. Where are we drawing these lines? These are generally drawn arbitrarily by legislators at particular times in history. I'm fascinated by the current research and practice of microdosing psychogenics, which I believe, well, I know from experience, can have, I've got to be very careful what I say here, in case I'm inciting people to break the law, can have a beneficial effect on certain forms of, in my case, depression.
Right.
Yeah. I've been prescribed every fashionable prescription drug under the world to cope with depression. My mother was a lifetime depressive. It's in the book. I grew up with that, and I've had it. And the only thing that has ever worked for me, I underline, in those circumstances, is microdosing psychogenics. That's my honest opinion. I'm prepared to be wrong, but I don't think anyone's in a position to deny my own lived experience.
Absolutely.
In that area.
And I think there is more and more research that's coming out lately. As a matter of fact, there is a European Psychedelics Association. If I'm not,
I know.
Yeah.
Can we work?
Yeah. maybe after this podcast.
Maybe.
It'd be a good
Well, if
chance
you're
to-
out there,
yeah.
give us a shout.
Yeah. I think we did do a social media training for them at some point, a couple of years ago.
I always used to joke, and just the last little funny, of an age when I was at university, there was always an address to the Union General Meeting by the campaign for the legalization of cannabis. Only there wasn't because they were always late.
Yeah.
They never turned up. I slept in.
Yeah. That tends to be the stereotype associated, but then, you and me, we know, I think a lot of people in the network, that this doesn't really quite describe how they are. Peter, it's been very interesting. I think we could keep going forever, but since we already changed two technicians, worn out two phones.
The last one ran screaming from the room.
Yeah. And it is Friday, and it is past 4 o'clock, which means it's time also to
time for beer.
Or something along those lines. But thank you very much.
Oh, thank
you.
you.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
I've enjoyed
I
it
think
a lot.
your story is fascinating. There's so many other things that I wanted to ask you about, but then we could talk for hours.
Can I just underline the fact that you can get the book at Amazon, Waterstones, Ball.com, Barnes and Noble, all of those.
My choice of words.
My choice of words.
Yeah, absolutely. Check it out. I read it briefly, quickly, but it's as I told Klim earlier today, it's a very nice, easy read, but that does does spark certain emotions as you read it, because it's genuine, open, and
I'm glad you
honest.
enjoyed it.
So, Peter, thanks again. And
Thank you.
Let's grab that beer.